Hello, students. Welcome back to our next segment on renewable energy sources. And if you recall from yesterday, we talked about wind, not passing it, but using it to generate electricity. And so, refer to your notes from yesterday to get a recap on wind energy. But today, we're going to move on to our second form of renewable energy, which is for today, water energy. So, let's talk about water energy today. And I'll say at the onset that wind energy and water energy, the utilization of them is very similar to one another. You see, scientists, in particular physicists, consider wind and water to be both fluids. They both exhibit similar characteristics to one another as they flow from one place to another. So wind flows and water also flows if you are a physicist. So back to water energy. Water energy is the flow of water resulting from the pull of gravity. If you look at a lake or a pond, the water doesn't move much. Why? Because gravity is pulling it down at an even level. And once water seeks a steady state, it won't move. It is if it is at the lowest point possible. However, if there's a hill of any kind, if there is a slope of any kind, if the topography of the land is such that there is a slope to the land itself, then gravity is pulling differently on the higher location as compared to the lower location. And if anything is on that sloped surface of land, including water, it's going to flow downhill. And that's what water does. If you've ever seen a stream, a river, a waterfall, like the beautiful one pictured here, for instance, then you know that water flows downhill, and it is the force of gravity, which we've learned about in the past, that is responsible for this downward flow. Now, I don't know about you, but I would not want to be canoeing or kayaking on the top of this river and encounter this waterfall. That would be a scary thing, and it would probably be a very deadly thing. It would probably be the last thing you ever did in your life, because the force of gravity pulling something down a waterfall is pretty strong. And you would experience the strength of that gravitational pull if you were pulled down a waterfall, but you wouldn't be able to share that experience with anyone else. So we can enjoy it by looking at a waterfall, because water itself is not a living thing, and we can watch relaxing flow of water down a cliff like this in the form of a waterfall. Now, just like wind energy, water energy has been used for centuries and centuries. In fact, most of human civilization, if you look at history, most civilizations settled in areas near flowing bodies of water, like near rivers. Why? Well, you got a steady supply of fresh water to drink, and you've got a ready supply of moving water to tap into. And until the mid 1800s, water wheels were used almost exclusively to grind grain with millstones, or to power saws, to cut lumber, to build homes and houses and ships. Water's power is incredible, and tapping into that power has been known about for a long time, and has been and continues to be a very effective and essentially free source of energy. You don't have to pay to turn gravity on here on Earth. Gravity is just the force that exists because the Earth is here. And if you've got water flowing downhill because of gravity and you can tap into it, that's like free energy. So if you've ever had opportunity to visit an historic site like Millbrook Village or Williamsburg or any number of other historic sites, you may have been able to see functioning water wheels attached to a mill operating various things, whether it be grinding grain or operating saws, no matter what it is, tapping into that water is fantastic. Now, why don't we use it on a large scale anymore? Well, in the late 1800s, water wheels were largely replaced by steam engines for good reason. As I mentioned earlier, water wheels and the mills attached to them are confined to locations where there is moving water. Well, there are only so many streams and rivers to tap into. What if you want to settle in an area where there are no streams and rivers? Well, in the mid 1800s, steam engines were invented, developed, and began to be utilized. And a steam engine could operate anywhere, or at least anywhere that you have a fuel source and you could bring water to the steam engine at least. But you didn't have to have running water to operate a steam engine. So in the late 1800s, during the Industrial Revolution, this steam engine started to replace the water mills all over the place, and new mills were developed utilizing steam exclusively. And all they had to do was burn a fuel like wood or coal and create enough heat energy to turn the water into steam, which would be powerful enough to turn various turbines and, well, locomotives too, for that matter, but turn the engines in order to do the work that water wheels used to accomplish. So, grinding grain, cutting lumber, all of those things were replaced with the steam engine. Now, in the late 1800s, Thomas Edison's light bulb was not only very innovative, but it also promised the transformation of nighttime. You see, because before Edison's time, when the sun set, it got dark. That may be a difficult concept for some of you to even grasp a hold of. But before electricity was utilized, beginning in the late 1800s, for thousands of years, when the sun set, it got dark, very dark. It wasn't until the human species perfected fire making that we were even able to generate any heat or light into the wee evening hours. But before the 1800s, we would use candles with wax or with fat or oil lamps in order to generate enough light to do anything at night, primarily read. But we wouldn't keep those lamps on all night because they were an enormous fire hazard. Because in order to generate light, you needed to generate fire. And fire in a wooden house, not a good combination if you don't want your house to burn down. With Edison, however, and with electricity, there was a promise of lighting up your home in the evening without the fear of burning your house down. And if you had electricity in your home, my goodness, you could light up your entire house just by flipping a switch. This was a monumental change in the technology of average everyday life. And so we wanted to generate more electricity because there was a greater demand for electricity. The more people found out about these electric light bulbs, the more people wanted them. And the more people wanted them, well, they had to get electricity somehow. So we used windmills, we used water mills and converted them into power generating stations. And when we talk about water generating stations, we're talking about something called hydroelectric power. Hydro, the prefix hydro refers to water. Electric refers to electricity, obviously, and power refers to power. But as we mentioned before, because of the force of gravity, when gravity's pulling water down, it does so with a lot of energy. And if you can tap into the use of falling water or running water, then you can generate electricity using electrical generators. Now, in the western part of the U.S., there are huge hydroelectric power plants. And these dams dam up rivers in order to create artificial lakes behind them. And then that water falls down through the dam into a generating station with a lot of energy. And some of these hydroelectric power plants power entire cities, if not entire states. So hydroelectric power, if we were to look at a cross section here, and again, I'll be linking you to some videos that show this remarkably well. So here we have a typical dam. Behind the dam, we build an artificial reservoir, and the water is allowed in a controlled fashion, which doesn't happen with wind. With wind, you can't control the wind, but with hydroelectric power, you can control the flow of water. You can control its velocity and its volume. And by controlling those parameters, you can create a steady supply of electricity, which you can't do with wind power. So there are definite advantages to using hydroelectric power if the environmental conditions are suitable. Here we have a controlled flow of water coming down through the dam, turning a generator, allowing the water to flow out. The only byproduct of this is, well, water flowing out of the bottom of the dam and the production of electricity. It's actually pretty good. But as we said yesterday, you can't get something for nothing. So there are limitations to hydroelectric power as well. First, there are some environmental impacts. What do I mean by that? Well, when you have a free-flowing river, like in the top diagram, you've got the flow of water freely going, and any life forms in there, like the fish, are able to go back and forth. We have spawning fish, etc. As soon as you put a barrier in front of flowing water, you change the entire ecosystem. Here in New Jersey and Warren County, there have been over the years a number of rivers, smaller rivers, that have had dams on them, and the dams have been torn down to increase the wild nature of the rivers and to allow the water to flow in an uncontrolled fashion to restore the environmental benefits. One of the impacts here of having a dam is called sedimentation. So in addition to stopping regular flow of water unimpeded, and by the way, some dams have what are called fish ladders on them. You can see a fish ladder locally here where the Lehigh River empties into the Delaware River. And they've built a fish ladder in order to allow spawning fish like the shad here in the Delaware to swim upstream into the Lehigh River again. Sometimes they're more effective than others. Wait until I show you the video on a fancy fish ladder. I think you're going to love it. But it's back to sedimentation. Sedimentation is the buildup of particles behind the dam. Here's the deal. When you've got fast-moving water, the sediments are carried all the way down to the ocean. When you've got fast-moving water that slows down because of a dam, particles start settling out of that water. And as the particles settle out, it builds up layers of sediment. In fact, it's been said that the average lifespan of a dam is about 100 years. Because after about a century of water flowing into an artificial reservoir, enough sediment builds up to block up the entire reservoir. Eventually, all of this sediment builds up and the dam becomes ineffective. There's no depth to the water to allow for the flow of water through a generating power, and it's basically useless. And so what has been happening here now that we're at the century mark to a lot of major dams is a lot of dams are being blown up and destroyed and having the sediment allowed to be flushed through and restore the natural environment to the river. In other cases, the water behind is being dredged, meaning the sediment is being removed to allow for a greater depth of water for power generation. That takes an enormous amount of planning, and then you have to find some place to put that sediment as well. So another limitation to using water energy, hydroelectric power plants, is flooding river valleys. Now, that may not seem like a big deal at first until you think about whether or not anybody lives in a river valley which is being dammed up with a dam, and it creates an enormous reservoir behind it. Now, locally to us, here in Warren County, New Jersey, we have a place called Merrill Creek Reservoir. Now, it wasn't a dammed up river per se, but it was a dam built on the top of a mountain. And there's a pipeline between Merrill Creek Reservoir and the Delaware River, and the reservoir is filled primarily with water from the Delaware River. Now, I'm not getting into the pros or cons or the usefulness of this reservoir, although I will say it's a great place for kayaking and canoeing and fishing today. But I'm old enough, and I grew up in Harmony, where this reservoir is, that when I was a kid, my school bus used to drive to what is now 200 feet below water. You see, there were people who lived at the bottom of what is now the reservoir. And so the folks that used to live down there, some of my friends, in fact, they had to move out of that area because if they didn't, their homes would be over 200 feet below the surface of water. So there is an impact there. There is an impact. There's an impact on people. There's an impact on wildlife. There's also an impact on historical and prehistorical culture. Out west, for instance, many of the canyon lands are canyons where ancient people used to live. And ancient people that used to live in these valleys, their whole lives were lived there. Their former dwellings are there. Their ancestors are buried there. Remnants of their cultures are still there with petroglyphs and hieroglyphs, drawings and on the cliff sides and dwellings in the cliff side. If you dam up a valley like this, all of that will be under the water. This was a big deal a number of years ago in Egypt, as I recall, because the ancient Egyptian culture existed near the Nile River Valley. And at one point, they built a dam, but they didn't want to submerge some of the amazing statues. And so they literally moved the statues, these rock sculptures, to a different location so they wouldn't be buried by water. So another limitation, flooding river valleys. Again, could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. And this could be seen as a good or a bad thing, controlling floods. In nature, there are rivers that flow through areas, and these rivers that flow through areas form what is called a floodplain. It is normal and it is okay that when it rains a lot, rivers overflow their banks and flood the valley surrounding the river. That's why we call them floodplains. Now, one of the benefits to floodplains to humans is that these floodplains form incredibly fertile soil. I referred to Egypt a little while ago, the Fertile Crescent in the Mideast, Egypt in Northern Africa. These are regions known for the blossoming of human civilization because of the rivers and the floodplains that existed with great fertile soils that brought about the agricultural revolution. That's a good thing. Now, how is this a bad thing? Well, over time, people have enjoyed moving water. They find it relaxing. Right here locally, we have got a lot of folks that live along the Delaware River. But here's the deal. When you build a home along a river in a floodplain, you can't stop nature. At some point, it's going to rain a lot, and the river is going to overflow its banks and flood the floodplain. And so if we have people in that floodplain, there is an impact on people's homes and on their lives. It would be much better if nobody built on floodplains and we allowed the floodplains to take care of themselves. But who's going to tell you to move out of your home? It does happen. It does happen, but it doesn't make people happy. So dams can be used to actually control floods upstream and downstream of the dam itself. And that has been an argument that has been used over the years as both a benefit and a limitation. Here's another limitation, by the way. Building dams prevents spawning fish that spend most of their year or most of their life in the ocean and then come upstream in rivers to spawn, to reproduce. If they hit a dam along the way, well, their species can come to an end if they have no spawning location to reproduce and produce another generation. And so this has been a major environmental impact on many rivers throughout the country in terms of the utilization of rivers for spawning fish. Excuse me, I have the hiccups here a little bit. In fact, maybe I'll drink some water to energize my diaphragm so I don't have the hiccups anymore. Ooh, I think it worked. Yay! All right, so preventing fish from spawning can be another limitation. Again, I'm going to link you to some videos here that show things that have been done to overcome this limitation to water energy. I've talked a lot here today. I just have a little bit more left, but I think I'll save it for next time. So for now, I'll say bye-bye.